Evergreen Heights is a suburban neighborhood located in the western outskirts, where smooth paved roads meander beneath rows of ancient maple trees. In late autumn, the leaves turn from golden yellow to deep red, covering the roads and rooftops with a brilliant carpet. Early mornings bring a blanket of mist, the air is crisp, and the scent of dried grass mingles with the aroma of coffee in this otherwise serene neighborhood. This season is usually the time when families trim bushes, rake leaves, repaint fences, and prepare for the colder months ahead. You can hear the rustling of dry leaves, the swish of brooms on driveways, and occasionally the hum of lawnmowers or leaf blowers. For many people, it's a gentle transitional period before the harsh winter sets in and snow covers the familiar streets. In the midst of this picturesque setting stands Marcus Green, a 30-something technology engineer, tall, with a warm expression and deep brown skin. He chose Evergreen Heights as his home a few years back, quickly befriending several of the neighbors. He loves greenery and enjoys the peace and quiet, always making sure to keep his property in good shape. Most weekends, he spends time cleaning out the garage, organizing tools, and checking on his car. On this particular Saturday in late autumn, as the last rays of the sun angled through the leaves, everything glowed in a golden hue. Marcus was wearing a simple gray sweatshirt, jeans, and sneakers. He had just finished cleaning some gardening equipment and was preparing to close the garage door. Evergreen Heights, being a relatively new suburban development, is home to mostly friendly neighbors who get along. However, across the street from Marcus's place sits a house painted in a creamy white color, complete with ornate iron fencing and noticeably bigger than the other homes. Its owner is Vivian Blake, a middle-aged woman who often stands on her porch, arms crossed, a sharp gaze constantly surveying the neighborhood. Vivian is known for her habit of meddling in other people's business and finding faults everywhere. She always appears meticulously dressed, wearing bold lipstick, with her brown hair styled in classic curls. She seems to see herself as the neighborhood watchdog. If something isn't to her liking, she complains to the homeowners association or, worse yet, calls the police. More than once, she's called them over trivial matters like a simple backyard barbecue that she deemed too noisy. Marcus has felt the brunt of her scrutinizing stare a few times, but he's tried to ignore it. He'd hoped that, given time, she would come to see that he was just a normal, harmless neighbor. That afternoon, after double-checking that his car was secure inside the garage, Marcus pressed the button to close the overhead door. The mechanism whirred, and the garage door began to descend heavily. Just then, he noticed a figure out of the corner of his eye. Turning, he saw Vivian standing on her porch, arms folded tightly, a grim line on her lips, her brows furrowed. Marcus was taken aback momentarily but thought maybe she'd just come out for fresh air. He gave a polite nod and a small smile. However, contrary to his expectation, Vivian did not smile back. She abruptly stepped off the porch, striding purposefully toward Marcus. Her high heels struck the ground with a sharp clip, and she practically shouted, "What are you doing here? Why are you lurking around this house?" Marcus was startled. He tried to maintain a polite tone, knowing that getting angry would only make things worse. He responded softly, "I'm Marcus, the owner of this house, Vivian. I was just tidying up my garage, that's all." At this, Vivian gave a contemptuous sniff, her skeptical gaze sizing him up from head to toe. "Don't lie to me. I know everyone who lives in this neighborhood. You're obviously an outsider. I'm not letting you pull anything around here." Before Marcus could say more, she pulled out her phone. Right in front of him, she dialed 911 and spoke with urgent intensity, like someone facing a dangerous criminal. "Yes, police? There's a suspicious man standing right in front of my house. He's sneaking around the garage. Come quickly, I feel threatened." Marcus stood there, eyes wide, heart pounding in shock. He had heard whispers about Vivian's extreme behavior, but never imagined she would call 911 on him simply for closing his own garage. Shaking his head, he bit back a sigh of frustration. Deep down, he felt both helpless and resentful. But there was nothing to do but wait for the police to arrive and clarify, since he had done nothing wrong. About 15 minutes later, a police car from the local precinct slowly turned onto Evergreen Drive. By this time, the sky had grown darker, the sun was sinking behind the maple trees. The flashing lights on the cruiser created an unusual tension in this normally quiet suburb. Two officers stepped out, Officer Brantley, a tall middle-aged man with a stern expression, and Officer Alvarez, a younger woman in her early 30s with keen eyes. They approached Marcus, who was standing near his driveway with his hands visible, trying not to appear threatening. Vivian remained nearby, arms crossed, her lips tightened, repeatedly gesturing toward Marcus as if to say, "That's him, arrest him." Officer Brantley spoke calmly. "We got a call about suspicious activity. Could you tell us what happened here?" Marcus explained briefly that he owns the house and was simply putting away items in the garage. There was no intrusion, no criminal behavior. Both officers surveyed the scene, the house had the correct address, Marcus's car had valid plates, nothing appeared out of place. At their request, Marcus provided ID and some property documentation. He kept a photocopy of his home purchase records in a small file, just in case. The police cross-checked the information and concluded that everything was in order. Officer Alvarez, eyebrows slightly raised, then turned to Vivian, her tone calm but firm. "Mrs. Blake, it looks like there's nothing suspicious going on here at all. Next time, please consider carefully before calling 911 to avoid unnecessarily using emergency resources." Vivian bit her lip, ready to protest, but realized she couldn't argue once the papers proved Marcus's ownership. Scowling, she turned on her heel and marched back to her luxurious home. The officers nodded goodbye to Marcus and drove off. As the sound of the police car's engine faded, Marcus let out a deep breath. Although he was relieved that the truth had prevailed, the incident left a bitter taste in his mouth. Why had she assumed he was an intruder just because of his skin color? After the police incident, Marcus's days seemed to slow down. Whenever he walked around the block or took out the trash, he noticed Vivian's silhouette behind her second-floor window or behind her thick, dark curtains. And whenever Marcus was chatting with other neighbors, he sensed the flicker of blinds moving across the street as though she were spying on him. He also noticed some neighbors whispering amongst themselves. Most, however, were either friendly or neutral. They knew that Marcus was kind, always willing to lend a helping hand, and nothing like the trespasser Vivian portrayed him to be. One morning, while watering his front yard, Alicia, an Asian woman living in the adjacent house, came over to ask about what had happened. Alicia confided that Vivian had once harassed a Hispanic family in the neighborhood and they had guests over for a birthday party. Citing noise concerns, she encouraged Marcus not to take it personally. Marcus thanked her, but deep inside, he felt uneasy. Something in Vivian's behavior signaled danger. It went beyond just a nosy neighbor. One evening, as Marcus browsed the internet, he found himself dwelling on Vivian's aggressive demeanor and her seemingly hostile attitude. He wondered, could she have a darker past? As a tech engineer, he was adept at online searches. Initially, he tried simple keywords, Vivian Blake, Evergreen Heights, local disputes, hoping to find local news or neighborly spats. The results he came upon were initially mundane, referencing old articles about Vivian's complaints to the local HOA regarding street cleanliness or lampposts. But the deeper he dug, the more he stumbled upon mentions of lawsuits, heated quarrels, and scattered hints of this same Vivian Blake or variations of her name connected to petty theft, insurance fraud, and even organized crime affiliations. Information on shady deals and records that had mysteriously been expunged began to surface. One anonymous post also mentioned that Vivian had once been involved in an extremist group and had reportedly organized racially motivated gatherings. It all made Marcus's blood run cold. There was no conclusive proof, but his instincts told him that this woman was far more dangerous than he had initially assumed. She wasn't merely a grumpy neighbor, she might be harboring a history of criminal activity. The next morning, as Marcus sipped coffee on his porch, Daniel, a colleague who also lived nearby, stopped by. Noticing Marcus's thoughtful expression, Daniel asked, "You look worried. Man. Everything okay?" Marcus recounted his run-ins with Vivian and the strange facts he'd uncovered online. Daniel, who was Latinx, revealed that Vivian had once questioned him similarly when he came home late from work, prying about where he'd been and what he was doing. Hearing Marcus's story, Daniel shuddered. "I think you should be careful. She's not just biased, she might actually be dangerous if she has a criminal past. Don't let your guard down." Marcus nodded, contemplative. A sense of dread weighed on him whenever he caught sight of Vivian. Was her habit of making unfounded accusations just the beginning? A few days later, a light drizzle fell throughout the afternoon. By early evening, the rain had tapered off. Marcus slipped on a jacket and a baseball cap to bring his trash bin from the curb back to the garage. It was routine. Suddenly, across the street, Vivian emerged wearing a bright red raincoat, phone already in hand. The moment she spotted Marcus, she raised her voice. "What are you doing near my house? Have you been staring into my windows? Don't think I don't notice." Marcus blinked in surprise. The distance between their houses was large enough that he had hardly glanced in her direction, let alone peeped in her windows. Her accusation was absurd. "Mrs. Blake, I'm just taking my trash bin in. Please calm down." Instead of calming down, Vivian immediately dialed 911 again, using that same shrill urgency. "Police, come quick. That man of color is still roaming in front of my house. I'm scared for my safety. He does this every day. He's dangerous, I'm sure of it." Marcus gripped the trash can handle, heart racing with a mixture of anger and helplessness. It seemed they were repeating the same cycle. The police would arrive, he'd have to prove yet again that he wasn't doing anything wrong. But this time, Marcus had a plan. He had prepared documents that might finally expose Vivian's history. About 10 minutes later, the wail of a police siren echoed. A squad car pulled up in front of Marcus's driveway. Two officers stepped out, Officer Decker, a seasoned, older man, and Officer Hill, a woman in her 40s with a watchful gaze. They wore stoic expressions, possibly exhausted by yet another call from the same source. Vivian rushed up to them, spewing accusations. "He's harassing me, every single day. I feel unsafe in my own home." Marcus inhaled deeply, walked over, and spoke calmly. "Officers, this is the second time in a week Mrs. Blake has called you about me without grounds. Previously, I showed the authorities that I own this property. Tonight, all I did was bring my trash bin inside, no trespassing whatsoever." Officer Decker studied Marcus, then glanced at Vivian, his eyes narrowing. "All right, Mr. Green. Could you show us some proof of ownership again, or any ID?" Marcus nodded, pulling out his phone to show digital scans of his property documents. Officer Decker reviewed them. Just as before, everything was legitimate. Meanwhile, Officer Hill looked over at Vivian, noticing her muttering something about faking documents and "he's not who he says he is." Suddenly, Marcus turned to Officer Decker with a serious tone. "Officer, I've researched Mrs. Blake's background. I have evidence she has a criminal record and possible ties to extremist groups. I believe these repeated calls are acts of harassment with a racial motive. The officers paused and turned their full attention to Marcus. He produced a folder containing the material he had printed from his online search, news clippings, references to old court proceedings. Evidence of possible links to organized crime, assault charges, and insurance fraud, all connected to Vivian. Officer Decker frowned as he began flipping through the documents. Watching the officers examine the documents, Vivian became increasingly agitated. She rushed forward, pointing a shaking finger at Marcus. "You liar! How dare you snoop into my past?" She then turned to the two officers, nearly shrieking. "Can't you see? He's forging everything, framing me. He's an intruder and a fraud. I'm the victim here." Officer Hill remained calm. "Mrs. Blake, please stand back. We will examine these materials. If Mr. Green is making a formal complaint, we need to look into it." At that point, perhaps pushed to the brink, Vivian unleashed a stream of hateful slurs aimed directly at Marcus. Her words dripped with malice and bigotry, echoing clearly through the quiet neighborhood. The two officers stood stunned. Several nearby residents who had been watching from their porches also looked on in shock. Under the porch light, Vivian's face twisted with venomous rage. Marcus stood still. Fists clenched, his heart pounding as he endured her barrage of insults. But he kept his composure because he realized her words were now incriminating evidence. The officers could see firsthand that she wasn't just an overzealous neighbor, she was acting with racial prejudice. Just then, Alicia, the neighbor who had previously spoken with Marcus, appeared with Daniel. They decided to step forward rather than watch passively, ready to confirm what Marcus had been experiencing. Alicia spoke up. "I live next door to Marcus. I can attest he's done nothing wrong. Mrs. Blake has repeatedly harassed us and used hateful language. She's done it to me, too. Telling me to go back to my country, even though I'm a legal citizen." Daniel added. "She doesn't just yell. She spies and intimidates people, making us all feel unsafe." Their testimony bolstered Marcus's account. Officer Decker glanced at Officer Hill, and it was clear from their faces they sided with Marcus. Finally, after examining the documents Marcus provided, considering Alicia and Daniel's statements, and having witnessed Vivian's hateful outburst firsthand, Officer Decker pulled out his handcuffs. He declared, "Mrs. Blake, we have reason to believe you filed false reports, committed repeated acts of harassment, and possibly violated hate crime statutes. We're placing you under arrest for further investigation." Vivian's eyes went wide as she screamed. "You have no right. I've lived here for years. You're making a huge mistake." She struggled as the cuffs were placed on her wrists, but Officer Hill kept her in check, leading her to the patrol car. Another officer was called in for assistance and to conduct a brief initial search of Vivian's house with expedited clearance from higher-ups. They wanted to ensure there were no illegal weapons or further evidence of wrongdoing. Vivian continued to howl. "I'll sue all of you. You'll see." As the police car's door slammed shut, the entire neighborhood seemed to exhale. People watching from a distance slowly went back to their homes. In the ensuing days, the police informed Marcus that upon searching Vivian's house, they found documents linking her to extremist groups, plus evidence she had been planning an unauthorized gathering. Further investigation into her old criminal record surfaced. She had once been involved with a criminal gang in another state, committing multiple offenses, but had received a suspended sentence. Thanks to numerous under-the-table arrangements, her records were partially expunged. But now, these new offenses threatened to revoke any leniency she had previously been granted. Word of her arrest spread quickly around Evergreen Heights. Residents were simultaneously stunned and, in some cases, relieved. It became clear that she had used her respectable homeowner facade to bully others. Additionally, her deeply rooted prejudice had led her to target anyone who wasn't white. Following those tense days, Marcus sometimes felt he had to catch his breath. He often pondered late at night. I'm just an ordinary guy who wants a peaceful life. Why did this have to happen? Still, he realized if he hadn't stood up for himself, Vivian's harassment might have continued or escalated, endangering him or his neighbors. Daniel and Alicia openly expressed their gratitude. They admired Marcus's bravery in uncovering Vivian's criminal background for the police. In casual chats by the fence or during walks, neighbors acknowledged that Vivian's behavior highlighted a crucial lesson: staying silent in the face of bigotry and intimidation only allows it to grow. Sometimes, one must act and speak out to end such a toxic cycle. Marcus confided that while he felt anger and frustration, he also felt sadness, sad that such hatred and racism still existed. Nonetheless, he was encouraged by how many neighbors, Alicia, Daniel, even Mr. Harold, an elderly white man on the corner, supported him and validated his experiences. Mr. Harold, a septuagenarian who has lived in Evergreen Heights since it was farmland decades ago. Though his health has declined, his mind remains sharp. Upon hearing the story, he told Marcus, "Don't worry, son. I've seen you're not doing anything wrong. I'm willing to testify if needed." Min, the local shop owner, he shared how Vivian once yelled at him simply because he didn't stock the produce she wanted. "If I had known how dangerous she was," he said, "I'd have reported her sooner. I feel relieved now that she's gone." The Garcia family, they had also fallen victim to Vivian's threats when she complained about their daughter's birthday party, accusing them of unlicensed gatherings. They nearly ended the party in fear. Later, they realized she had only been trying to intimidate them. All these testimonies, combined with formal complaints, helped the police build a stronger case to show that Vivian had continually harassed families of different backgrounds. A week later, the police summoned Marcus to give an official statement. At the station, Officer Decker told him, "We found more than just documents about extremist groups in Mrs. Blake's home. There's also evidence suggesting she intended to scare the entire neighborhood to assert her control." Marcus felt a chill as he imagined Vivian's plan, systematically using intimidation and possibly violence. Officer Decker looked Marcus in the eye. "We appreciate what you did. Had you not provided those leads, she might have continued or escalated her actions. It'll take a few months for a full trial. But we'll make sure she stays away from the community." These words lifted a weight off Marcus's chest. He thanked the officer and stepped out into a light drizzle, reflecting on how his neighbors had shown solidarity. In adversity, they had come closer together. With Vivian gone, Evergreen Heights appeared to return to its usual tranquility. Gone was the piercing stare from the second-floor window of the big white house. Occasionally, someone would ask Marcus, "What if she comes back after she's released?" and he would reply, "I don't know. But I trust the law to handle the situation appropriately." What Vivian left behind was a memory of a neighbor who was not just difficult but genuinely dangerous, fueled by prejudice and manipulation. Yet, more deeply, her story reminded everyone of the importance of respect and understanding, and of standing up firmly against harmful behavior. Some nights, Marcus had trouble sleeping, replaying the moment Vivian was handcuffed, ranting at the officers. He wondered, was this the only possible outcome for her? Perhaps if she had chosen to live respectfully, she might not have ended up this way. However, he acknowledged that her extremist beliefs and criminal affiliations ran too deep to be just a quirky personality trait. As for the rest of the neighborhood, people took a stronger stand against any sign of hateful behavior. A small group, including Daniel, Alicia, Mr. Harold, and Marcus, formed what they called the Neighborhood Connect Committee. They planned to host cultural gatherings, potluck events, and open invitation cookouts, aiming to break down any lingering barriers related to race or background. Nobody wanted another Vivian to appear. During a more thorough search of Vivian's home, the police discovered a hidden safe in her basement. Inside were more incriminating documents, phone records of her communications with an extremist group in another state, and a target list of neighbors she intended to intimidate or harm: Marcus, Alicia, the Garcia family, Min from the corner store, among others. Hearing that chilled the entire neighborhood. Vivian had gone much further than anyone suspected, and the authorities believed she might be just one link in a larger chain of extremists. Regardless, her arrest could prove vital in dismantling this network of hate. Marcus was startled and a bit fearful upon learning the news, but mostly, he felt gratified that by speaking up, he had contributed to stopping an even larger threat.